Good evening and a warm welcome to the IWM monthly lectures. Unfortunately still to be held only remotely, but fortunately at least Till van Rahden, who's my guest this evening and a visiting fellow at the IWM, can be here with me on the stage, and I hope in fall we can return to a normal audience at the Institute. So a warm welcome to you, Till, and thank you very much for being with us this evening. We are going to have a brief lecture by Till and then followed by a discussion with me, and then of course you're most welcome to ask all your questions. Please put them into the chat function and then I'll be reading them out. But if you want to raise a question yourself, you may even raise a hand. I'm not quite sure if I'll be able to. No. Okay, only chat function. So please use the chat function and I'll read out your questions for you. So let me very briefly introduce Till van Rahden, who's been with us before at the IWM. This is his second visit, I think, as a visiting fellow. He's full professor at the University of Montreal, where he held the Canada Research Chair in German and European Studies. And since last year, 2021, since this January 2021, he's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Forschungskolleg Humanwissenschaften of the University of Frankfurt. Till is a specialist in European history. Since the Enlightenment, his work has been primarily, until recently, concerned with German and Jewish history. The book that I would like to mention here is Jews and Other Germans, Civil Society, Religious Diversity and Urban Politics in Breslau, 1860 to 1925. The book which we're going to discuss today is one that actually got partly written at the IWM, so we can take some credit for it. And this is the book on democracy. It resonates very well with our democracy focus at the Institute. It's titled Demokratie, eine gefährdete Lebensform. So democracy, form of life which is endangered, but one could also say a fragile form of life. And his work on democracy has dealt before this book on also questions of minority rights and the formation of minority rights in Europe. This work in particular addresses tensions between the elusive promises of equality, democratic equality, and the recurrent presence also of moral conflicts. In this book, you identify democracy not primarily as a system of government, though it is a system of government, but you would like us to focus not on the institutional and normative aspects of democracy, but democracy as a way of life. And the important point that you make here is to make the argument that liberal democracy, its institutional forms and norms are necessary, but they are not sufficient, especially at a time when democracies are under attack all over the world. It's important to think about some other preconditions of what keeps democracies alive, and also more pertinently even the question, how could we nurture and protect our democratic practices, and in what kinds of public spaces can these be nurtured? So let me give the word to you and we'll come back to some of the questions that I have and then to the questions of the audience.
So thank you so much for the generous introduction. I'm delighted and honored to be back at the IWM. Coming here to speak about democracy makes me feel like the hare in the fable of the hare and the hedgehog. So whatever I'm going to argue tonight, I will encounter a friendly shout of all the local hedgehogs. We are already here. We have thought the thought before, but hopefully I will emerge out of the evening. Unlike the hare, I will emerge out of the evening alive. So the other thing I would like to mention is that Vienna, at least the Vienna of the interwar period, is probably one of the key sites for the making of contemporary democratic theory. Interwar Vienna was home to Josef Schumpeter, it was home to Hans Kelsen, and it was home to Hermann Heller. And all three thinkers bring a specific Habsburg sensitivity to questions of democratic theory that we would do well to remember. However, by way of introduction, I would like to invoke Walt Whitman's essay, Democratic Vistas, first published in 1870. The essay has become a key reference point in American democratic thought, yet it was originally written against the background of the Civil War, the darkest moment in the history of the American Republic. The poet reflected on the democracy to come in a war-torn society more deeply divided and polarized than any contemporary democracy, including post-Trumpian America or Viktor Orban's Hungary. When the Civil War broke out, the 42-year-old Whitman moved to Washington, D.C. There he volunteered as a nurse in army hospitals, caring for the wounded and the dying. In the midst of suffering and despair, the poet became convinced that a society based on the idea of universal equality and individuality depended on the ethos of its citizens. The movements of the late Secession War, Whitman noted, quote, show that popular democracy, whatever its faults and dangers, practically justifies itself beyond the wildest hopes of its enthusiasts. One night in the gloomiest period of the war in the Patent Office Hospital in Washington, Whitman recalls that he, quote, stood by the bedside of a Pennsylvania soldier who lay conscious of quick approaching death, yet perfectly calm and with noble spiritual manner. To Whitman, this composure was emblematic of a democratic character. Quote, what we have here, if not the plentifully supplied last needed proof of democracy in its personalities. Whitman's faith in democracy became a message of hope in a time of doubt, divisiveness, and despair. Even in, quote, downcast hours, citizens would believe the ulterior object of government to be not merely to rule, to repress disorder, etc., but to develop, to open up to cultivation, to encourage the possibilities of all beneficent and manly outcroppage, and of that aspiration for independence and the pride and self-respect latent in all characters. Whitman's manly outcroppage was generic, including all races, women as well as men. Quote, democracy in silence, biding its time, ponders its own ideals, he argued, not of literature and art only, not of men only, but of women. To Whitman, democracy was first and foremost a matter of quotidian experiences. Did you too, oh friends, suppose democracy was only for elections, for politics and for a party name? The poet asked, only to answer unequivocally, I say democracy is only of use there that it may pass on and come to its flower and fruits and manners, and the highest forms of interaction between men and their beliefs. In religion, literature, colleges and schools, democracy in all public and private life. Unless democracy, quote, gets at least as firm and as warm a hold in men's hearts, emotions and belief, as in their days feudalism and ecclesiasticism, and inaugurates its own perennial sources, its strength will be defective, its growth doubtful, and its main charm wanting. Reading Whitman in contemporary Vienna or Montreal, Budapest or Minsk, Tehran or Mumbai is not to embrace his transcendentalism, his deism, or his belief in American exceptionalism. As Michael Walzer notes in his book Radical Principles, Whitman's incantation of equality and freedom may strike us as, quote, too healthy, too easy in its democratic faith, untouched by the terrors of the 20th century. Yet, to dismiss Whitman as too naive, too sentimental, or too elusive comes at a price. His essay on democratic vistas and his poems, such as Song of the Broadaches, remind us that democracy calls for political theories and scholarly endeavors that are as rich in facets, imaginative, and as epic as the affairs reviewed. To study democracy, Whitman notes, is to encourage, quote, speculations on the soul. As an object of inquiry, democracy then is too important to be left to social scientists alone. Over the past 15 years, we have moved from complacency and hubris to panic and despair. After the end of the Cold War, liberal democracy was taken for granted. The field of transition studies that emerged after 1989 explored how liberal democracies and market economies could and should be established. Once post-communist countries had embraced Western democracy, social scientists assumed liberal democracy would resemble a perpetual motion machine, a clearly defined model of government that could be exported almost anywhere. Its history therefore merited little attention. For every analysis of how democracies came to be, and more importantly, how they survived, we have countless studies that explore the origins of fascism and other forms of tyranny and despotism. Now, liberal democracy is in crisis. Citizens are distancing themselves from politics. The people's parties are losing members and votes. Twitter and Instagram are crowding out public debates and civility. Proponents of soft authoritarianism are attacking an independent judiciary, the free press, and the rule of law. As a result, conversations across the globe today revolve around the question how democracies degenerate and die. In a spirit similar to Whitman's essay, my book, Democracy, A Fragile Way of Life, aims to challenge the sense of despair that informs recent conversations. Instead of obsessing about how democracies die, it might prove more useful to explore what keeps them alive. Scholars in the social sciences or in law who explore the cultural preconditions of democracy often focus on its normative foundations. In the post-war German context, the most influential thinker to highlight the nexus between a moral order and liberal democracy is Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförde. The legal theorist famously noted that, quote, the liberal state lives on premises that it cannot itself guarantee. Charles Taylor's idea of the social imaginary also responds to concerns about secularism and its discontents. Democracies, my fellow Montrealer argues, need a moral consensus that is based not on abstract Rawlsian reasoning, but on lived experiences, social imaginaries, in other words, that allow citizens to embrace democratic principles such as solidarity and equality. According to Taylor, the concept refers to, quote, the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. My aim today is to suggest why Birkenförder's fears may prove exaggerated, and why Taylor's emphasis on a shared morality is more problematic than is usually assumed. Conversations about the role of forms, of style, and of manners for democracy as a way of life may contribute to a more nuanced and, more importantly, imaginative understanding of democratic foundations. Questions of form and style may help us in our attempts to square the multicultural circle and to navigate the tension between equality and difference. To privilege forms over norms is to emphasize rules, manners, and conventions over shared values and an ethical consensus. If a pluralist liberalism is justified in putting moral incommensurabilities first, the foundations of democracy cannot be found in the realm of ethics. A republican constitution, as Immanuel Kant noted, would have to work not just for a nation of angels, but also for a nation of devils. It might therefore be more fruitful to focus less on the moral passions that citizens hold, be they devils or angels, and instead analyze how they articulate their ethical sentiments and fears in public. If liberal democracy is as much a way of life as it is a system of government, it is short-sighted to focus on shared values and a common social imaginary. If we understand diversity and discord as the inevitable effects of individual freedom, once we put cruelty and moral incommensurabilities at the heart of our understanding of democracy, we can fret less about social imaginaries and instead explore which forms, styles, and aesthetics stimulate, sustain, and revive democracy as a way of life. An emphasis on democratic ways of life, then, need not lead us to focus on questions of morality and norms. Instead, it invites us to analyze questions of form. Those who view cultural homogeneity as a prerequisite for liberal democracy overlook the fact that a specifically democratic form of civic cohesion emerges not from harmony, but rather from discord and strife. Our ability to accept moral dilemmas that we cannot solve, but only navigate, our capacity to grasp what we cannot embrace, presupposes forms and conventions, rules and procedures that allow us to live with deep pluralism. The concept of Lebensform, to use the German term for ways of life, is indebted to a strand in political theory that views democracy as a way of life. I draw on the ideas of pragmatist thinkers such as Jane Addams, John Dewey, or Richard Rorty, as well as those of transcendentalists such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, of course, or Emily Dickinson. Whatever its past and present shortcomings, the intellectual life in the American Republic has proved a more fertile ground for such controversies than Europe. At the same time, the concept of Lebensform is also a part of transatlantic exchanges. New world conversations drew on European legacies. As a moral category, the idea of Lebensformen dates back to Greek and Roman antiquity, where the concept of forma vivendi was used in the singular and defined the one and only way of leading a good life. By the time the term entered the vocabulary of modern philosophy, it had become a halfway house between a fully developed moral or ethical idea and an unconscious routine in our daily lives. For instance, in Wittgenstein's analogy between language games and forms of life in his philosophical investigations. To me, however, the work of Arno Borst is fundamental, and I quote, "Ever since humans have lived together, they have made use of social customs, the historian of medieval cultures, noted in 1973 in a paragraph that helps us understand the Middle Ages as well as post-war German and European history. And I quote, "There have been forms of life before antiquity and there will be after modern times, but their effect and estimation differ across the ages. Sometimes history disrupts how people reciprocate in everyday life and tears apart the social fabric. Then forms of life are no longer taken for granted. Instead, they are elevated to the level of morality and overestimated. Usually, however, history takes place outside the daily behavior of men towards each other and covers up the social fabric. Then forms of life seem all too natural and are underestimated as life's humdrum routines of banality." The concept of Lebensform, in other words, does two things. It offers a language of weak normativity that allows us to explore questions of moral history while avoiding strong moral judgments drawn from languages of values and norms. And it serves as an overarching concept that bridges the divide between the public and the private, a divide that is central to liberal democracies. Democracy, in short, is self-rule grounded in specific ways of life. Prompted to define it at the height of World War II, the American writer E.B. White invoked a spirit similar to Whitman's. Democracy, he noted in the New Yorker on July 3, 1943, and I quote, "is the line that forms on the right. It is the don't and the don't shove. It is the hole in the stuffed shirt through which the sawdust slowly trickles. It is the dent in the high hat. Democracy is the recurrent suspicion that more than half of the people are right more than half of the time. It is the feeling of privacy in the voting booths, the feeling of communion in the libraries, the feeling of vitality everywhere. Democracy is a letter to the editor. Democracy is the score at the beginning of the ninth. It is a song, the words of which have not gone bad. It's the mustard on the hot dog and the cream in the rationed coffee." Such reflections on ways of life, the humdrum banalities of everyday life, reflections about style and democratic spaces allow us to hone our feel for the cultural and social foundations of democracy. No matter how stable a democratic government and a constitutional order may seem, it will wither and perish without ways of life that allow for and encourage democratic experiences. If, as Böckenförde emphasizes, liberal democracy requires that citizens cultivate, shape, and renew a democratic ethos in everyday life, this presupposes a democratic commons, cultural forms and social spaces that offer everyone the chance to experience freedom and equality in everyday life. In short, to explore democracy as a way of life is to focus less on how democratic governments work, but on what democracy feels like in everyday life. Democratic ways of life do not emerge out of thin air. They presuppose a democratic commons, public spaces and institutions that allow for democratic experiences in everyday encounters among citizens. These include public squares and streets, public parks and swimming pools, municipal libraries and museums, kindergartens and playgrounds, youth centers and sports facilities, schools and universities. In other words, places and spaces that not only serve the greening of the city, transportation or education purposes, but above all invite people to stay and offer a stage for democratic participation. These spaces and places nurture a culture of equality and freedom in everyday encounters, a culture full of ambiguities that makes for intersecting social circles, a phenomenon that Georg Simmel identified as the hallmark of democratic individuality. Democratic culture is the seam line that holds citizens together and apart at the same time, allows them to be close enough without dissolving into one another, and distant enough without coming to alienation. One can think of this seam zone, which has been damaged during the pandemic by the numerous lockdowns and quarantine instructions, through the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott's concept of transitional space, an area that isn't you and isn't the other, but is the potential between you, which allows for creation, fantasy, and play. Together, these public spaces, places, and public goods embody the idea of the common good. They create the framework that allows citizens to cultivate a democratic ethos. Democracy thrives not only on creativity and play, but also on opposition, struggle, strife, and discord. But these deep divisions can only develop their creative potential if we preserve the democratic commons in which we can navigate conflicts and accept ambiguities. The more apparent the crisis of democracy is, the more evident it becomes how costly it is to cut the budget of those institutions and to neglect those public spaces and places that allow for democratic experiences and a deep pluralism, that strengthen the civic sense of community and the culture of participation and peaceful discord. The infirmity of the democratic commons is a threat to liberal democracy, first as a way of life, then also as a system of government. A democracy that no longer preserves these public goods and cultivates democratic ways of life puts at peril its social and cultural foundations. If we obsess about efficiency and performance, controlling and benchmarking in the public sphere and privatize public goods because the invisible hand of the market leads to supposedly fairer solutions, we lose our keen sense of democracy as a way of life. Especially in cities, it becomes apparent. The leaner and more efficient the state, the more liberal democracy is endangered. Democracy as a system of government, but above all, as a way of life, costs money. And without a strong, effective tax state, it is impossible to sustain it. More than other forms of rule, democracy needs spaces for democratic experiences, forums for and forms of civic discord, however inefficient they may be. If we do not want to give up the spaces of democratic experiences that enable us to fill the idea of a society of free and equal citizens with life and meaning, we can no longer afford the withering of our democratic commons and the loss of public goods. Without a democratic commons, democracy hangs in the air. It will wither and die. And it is for us, and this is where I will end, it is for us to keep it. Thank you.
So thanks so much. We're getting questions coming in, so I could start there. But let me start with a provocative question of mine and take you out of your field of Western liberal democracies. So you make the argument with Whitman, and some of the terms may sound old-fashioned, this democratic character, ethos, that democracy is not just about institutional arrangements, but needs to be cultivated in form and style. And then you had the argument that what democracy feels like is important. And I was thinking to myself, does democracy feel the same in a country like India as it does in Germany or the US? So would we need to pluralize this understanding of what a democratic character, or, for Whitman, for example, it's all about democratic individuality, even if it's not masculinity. He does include women, etc., but it's about individuality. What kind of democratic ethos would be there in a country like India, where I would say it's a communitarian democracy right from the beginning, because it starts with collective rights. It doesn't assume Western individuality as the basis of a democratic form of life. And of course, a democracy in 1947, when India becomes independent, is probably the most unlikely form of government. You can think of a society in which there are very strong feelings of community, and therefore the granting also of collective rights. It's a highly religious society. It's not secular. It's a society in which the majority of the population is illiterate. And yet democracy flourishes. People go to elections, and even today a lot more people go to the polls than in most Western democracies. So the question would be, do we need to think about the fact that democracy can feel very different in different contexts, and therefore the democratic ethos or democratic styles would also be very different. I mean, this, for example, Charles Taylor's argument, for example, is to pluralize secularism, if you like, right? So you would need to pluralize democracy, and you would, if you want to understand the Indian model of secularism, it's a very different one from the Western one. So the question is about pluralizing democracy along with this argument of yours.
I am very sympathetic to the thrust of your question, and the short answer is that concepts like a democratic way of life, or a democratic ethos, a democratic subjectivity, can only be had in the plural, because there's no sort of one-size-fits-all definition of a democratic way of life or a democratic ethos in the singular. And the reason for this is that, as you point out, that the meaning of the key concepts inherent in the democratic project, and I think the first two would be equality and freedom, and then you can add others like justice or solidarity or caring or care, vary greatly. And so the question, what, say, equality feels like in everyday encounters, is also going to vary greatly. So a form of recognition of equality in one context need not be the same form of recognition in another context. Standing in line, the line that starts on the right, not jumping the line, can mean very different things in different contexts. So the short answer is, indeed, we can only think of such things in the plural, and it's not just that there's a great variety of democratic ways of life. It's also that there is no, so to speak, abstract umbrella concept that would transcend all these particularities and differences. But there was something, you alluded to something that I think is also incredibly important to our conversations about democracy, and that is how unlikely democracy is.
That's right.
So, and it's precisely what you alluded to. You have people voting who are illiterate or barely literate, and they decide the most important matters of state with their vote in elections. Now that is absurd. the argument that in the European tradition goes back to Plato, and the response, or the short response to that, is Tom Paine, who says democracy gives rise to a genuinely democratic form of common sense, and that common sense is not something that a single person or a single class, a single educated elite might represent, but it's something that emerges out of the humdrum of banality of political struggles in everyday life, and then takes on a sort of political meaning. And I think that one of the, in a sense, problems that we see both in the European and North American context, but also outside of Europe, is that this, how shall I say this, the provocative nature of the democratic project that flies in the face of a lot of our base assumptions needs to be spelled out carefully in order to defend the democratic project.
So I think this is a good point. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to turn here and take one from the audience and then come back to some of mine, because I think the question here would be, thank you very much. I have a question here from Kaplan, who says, thank you for an enlightening lecture about democracy as a way of life and system of government. I understand the issue lifestyle and think this is important and it's part of a common good. But now comes a US-based question. So I thought, let's go from India to the US, then we come back to some of my questions, because I had certain questions about inculcation of democracy, especially because I think your book is very, very rich with empirical material on West Germany, and I would like to come to that, because it's about inculcating a certain way of life once it's broken and once it's after its absence. So it's not like something one can assume to be there. But let's go to the US first, because here is a very concrete question. What do you think about attacks against democracy by minorities that hope to retain power in the US? And he's referring to, of course, voter suppression by the Republican Party.
A short answer would be that I view voter suppression, sort of targeted forms of gerrymandering to defend, quote unquote, white majorities in certain parts of the United States, as a symptom of the crisis, or more general crisis, of democracy in the United States. That didn't come about with Trump, and it didn't come about with Reagan, and it didn't even come about with Barry Goldwater. But it is the other side of a loss of faith in such ideas as the democratic ethos, the democratic character, and the conviction that you find in Whitman, but also in the whole sort of American pragmatist tradition, that these everyday things, everyday practices are in fact what really makes democracy work.
So we have another question from a fellow, and we have several questions from fellows. So let's go to those for the moment, and then I come back to some of mine. Some of mine are also about democratic spaces, the cultivation of public good and spaces. So I can start with a question by one of our fellows, Sebastian Haug, who says, how would you summarize the least common denominator of democratic styles, manners, and forms across time and spaces? And so the additional question is, don't you think transitional spaces or plurality or the common good can also be found in non-democratic societies?
I will start at the end, and the short answer is yes, of course.
Yes.
And one way to understand the erosion of legitimacy in an authoritarian society is precisely to focus on these spaces in which people begin to practice democracy, and often practice democracy in everyday life. So one could, to take one example, one could read the political essays of members of the Charta 77 Or one can go and look at how they got together in their apartments or in the countryside, how they, in a sense, celebrated birthdays, social occasions, and how they practiced a different form of recognition and in which ideas of equality and ideas of freedom were central. And you could identify similar things in 19th century Europe. A lot of the either liberal or more radical democratic reform movements or revolutionary movements were precisely about creating these subversive spaces. So the question about the least, by least, am I right to assume that it means the lowest common denominator?
Yes, probably.
All right.
Yes.
I think the lowest common denominator is always the question of, challenging hierarchies, challenging coercion, challenging illegitimate forms of domination. And this can mean very, very different things. And we can, and again, it's very important to recognize how divergent all of these things can be. To take the example of children's education, there are many, many forms of democratic child rearing, and it would be absurd to assume that there is a magic formula for that. But what a democratic form of child rearing must center on is to make sure that authority is not necessarily done away, but authority is transcended in the context of a specific form of child rearing. And one could then go and say, so what is a democratic school? And again, it's not that a teacher in a democratic school can have no authority, but the way in which the teacher exerts the authority must allow the student to develop a critical ethos that ultimately transcends the teacher's authority, etc. And so that's, I think, sort of non-hierarchical, non-coercive, and a challenge to every form of illegitimate form of domination.
So maybe this is a good point at which to come to my question on West Germany, because I think the book is really written post-war Germany, right? Where you show the family to be a very, very important site of democratic practices, the cultivation of these practices, both in terms of what you just mentioned, child rearing, child socialization, but also in terms of changing the relationships between husband and wife, gender relations, right? And showing how in these intergenerational and relationships between father and mother, between partners, there is a change in what you describe as democratic fatherhood, which I found a very interesting concept, and I think it might be interesting to think with you about democratic fatherhood. And you point to kindergarten, schools, the home. So you are thinking of institutional spaces, but you're thinking of different institutional spaces, because the family is also an institution, right? Sociologically speaking. So it's not about just parliament, but you need institutional forms, but these are practiced in other institutions like these. So the question here would be not only to talk about your concept of democratic fatherhood and how it was cultivated, but two questions actually. One, what you show in the book is, and I think I'd like you to talk about it a little, how German courts are really central in creating these. So these don't emerge on their own, but there is a relationship between the legal sphere, legal institutions, the new legal norms which are being created, and the way in which they transform over time family relationships. And the other question would be, so the courts, if I look at the Indian example, can come with lots of progressive norms, and they don't really immediately translate into social changes. So the German question would be interesting empirically to understand how is it that Germans accept and also appropriate for themselves after fascist rule, after the breakdown of that entire regime into which a whole generation is socialized, how do they come to accept these very different new norms and also forms? Something else must happen for this acceptance to happen. I mean, that's what I'd like you to talk about.
So I think the starting point is the immediate post-war moment when many people believe that something has happened so horrendous that it should have never happened. And the conversation is actually very much aware of what historians and people who try to interpret Nazi Germany are also aware of, that these unspeakable crimes were committed by a nation that a few years earlier had been considered to be one of the most civilized nations of the world, and not just by Germans themselves, which would make for a funny argument. But sort of Americans were coming to Germany in the early 20th century, admiring municipal administration, admiring universities, admiring cultural life.
Exactly.
Right? And this sort of model of a civilized modern society suddenly commits these unspeakable crimes. And this moment that historians call a rupture with civilization devalues and ultimately puts into question moral certainties that have sort of driven the idea of democracy, the idea of civil society, the idea of liberalism, etc. So it's a country, a culture, an intellectual moment full of soul searching, doubts, and this includes the question of masculinity, it includes the question of patriarchy, and it includes the question of the family, right? So Nazism, to use a contemporary concept, is configured as a form of toxic masculinity, right? And therefore, a patriarchal conception of the family, at least as a sort of ideological project, has become questionable. And the courts, in some ways, are responding to an atmosphere, these convictions about the criticism of patriarchy that is coming from feminists, it's coming from socialists, it's coming from social democrats, and it's coming from liberals. And this is so overwhelming that attempts by more conservative clerical circles to reinstate a patriarchal family based on a Christian conception of natural law doesn't go very far, doesn't get very far. And which is why post-war West Germany is one of the first Western countries, with one brackets the Scandinavian countries, to dismantle the legal foundations of patriarchy in the late 1950s. So something that only happens in countries like France or Britain
much later,
15, 20 years later, right? Not to mention Switzerland.
I was going to say.
So I think that's really important. However, I think that there's something that is also something that is at work not just in post-war Germany, but in post-war Europe more generally. And I will just bring up Donald Winnicott again, who writes an essay about the meaning of democracy in 1949 or 1950. And at the heart of the essay is, so the one key element that makes democracy possible is the family. And according to Winnicott, actually he's much more precise, it's the mother.
I was going to
So
say.
the mother must be left alone so that the mother can raise good democratic citizens. And that's an obsession with the family that one finds across Europe, and that one also finds in the people's democracies of Eastern Europe, except obviously with a different twist. But again, what is really important and specific about post-war West Germany is the sense that one cannot draw on a long history of national traditions and questions of morality and ethics.
So it's a rupture, which is, and the courts are more in a reactive role rather than being the forerunners of social change. This is an interesting question. Let me come back here to one of the questions in the chat, and because that resonates with the next set of questions I wanted to ask you, Paul Lichterman, and he says the book makes a beautiful argument in a country, and he says in brackets, the contemporary United States, where many supposedly common spaces are class partitioned or racially segregated. How and where do we find forms of life that cultivate deep pluralism instead of defensive retreat to tribal enclaves?
So Paul Lichterman is much more knowledgeable than I am about this. So his own work provides answers to some of these questions. But I don't really want to go into the specifics so much. But I want there's a general argument that I think we need to sort of keep in mind. So all of these little humdrum banalities taken individually don't count for much. It is obvious that the whole of these democratic practices, the whole of these democratic experiences is much more than the sum of its parts. Right? It creates a culture in which questions of racism, structural discrimination of all kinds can be addressed more openly, more honestly, and more forcefully than in a culture where a democratic ethos is weakened. The idea of any form of structural discrimination is obviously offensive to people who truly believe in equality and who truly want to experience equal relations to their fellow citizens in everyday encounters. And again, so there are people who know much more about sort of the specific policies that a government, whether it's a municipal government, a state government, or a national government, or international organizations can pursue to weaken racist structures, to undermine structural racism. But I think the democratic ways of life are important because taken as a whole, they create an atmosphere that allows us to challenge these forms of exclusions and discriminations.
I think it's an interesting point. I want to come back to, this is Sebastian Haug, who's coming back with a question. And this is, I'm very sorry, I wish one could have a discussion where it would be possible to stick with one person and carry on a conversation. But I'm trying to follow chat. So it's sort of a little fragmented, this conversation. So I'd like to come back to Sebastian's question here, saying, thank you for your response. I still find it difficult to identify the core of your understanding of democratic lifestyle, and I'd like to press you a bit on this. We can arguably observe challenges to domination in many kinds of societies, many different kinds of societies, and it sounded like you agreed that what you had pointed to as examples of democratic practices can also be found in non-democratic settings. So his question still is, again, what is it about democratic practices that makes them exclusively or particularly democratic?
All practices in which we recognize one another as free and equal, right? And then it can take on many, many different meanings. But if you conduct a discussion. What is the seating arrangement? Who gets to sit where? Who gets to speak when? For how long? Etc. And it's clear that such things are often hierarchical, reflect forms of coercion and domination, dependence, and are sort of problematic if the assumption is that these moments are moments to cultivate a democratic ethos. Right? A similar thing is, again, very simple things. How do we greet one another in everyday life? Do we use formulas? Do we use rituals that in which we recognize one another as free and equal? Or do we immediately invoke hierarchies and dependencies? So I think those I could sort of obviously the key in every of these aspects is always in how far does a setting, and how far does a sort of range of manners encourage these rituals of recognition in which we experience one and each other as free and equal.
Mm-hmm. So that's. I want to come back to 2 points which you made in the talk. One is an argument about homogeneity, because your argument is it goes against the grain of a lot of the arguments being made these days, right? For democracies being somehow predicated on cultural homogeneity. And you say that it's mistakenly assumed to be a condition or a precondition or at least an enabling condition for democracy as a way of life, because all of those who are making arguments that migrants are the major threat to a democratic form of life, minorities, those whom Zygmunt Bauman just basically calls strangers, are those who are different from us, and they somehow threaten everywhere a democratic form of life. You make the opposite argument. Democracy not only needs agreement, but it thrives on disagreement. So could you say something about both the kinds of arguments for disagreement and the forms that disagreement should take, of course? And then, of course, the question is, what kinds of difference and disagreements, and what are the limits of tolerance of the kinds of disagreements and differences that one is willing to tolerate in a democracy? Because I think that is where the whole question comes up of, where is a tipping point when you allow certain kinds of illiberal, anti-democratic tendencies, also under forms of disagreement and a variety of political stances to flourish, you can very easily get to a point where it becomes very, very difficult to save a democratic ethos.
So for me, the starting point is a minimalist conception of democracy. And the sort of, you can start with Schumpeter, but the now dominant minimalist definition of democracy is Adam Przeworski, who says democracy is organized uncertainty. And what specific form that organized uncertainty takes, what form of elections, what form of electoral system, what form of democratic constitutionalism, what form of parliamentarism, and what form of perhaps other forms of civic participation other than elections, that is all open to question, and that's something we need to sort of struggle over the whole time. So in that sense, I think it's impossible to predict what democracies will look like in 30 years from now. The specific forms. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if we are constantly arguing over what specific form democracies should take, and if we are free to each make our own arguments, and if we are free to express our own convictions, passions, fears, obsessions as democratic citizens, what you have is a polyphonic, cacophonic mess of sort of political sentiments, passions, fears, etc. And so that is leads to these moral conflicts and to sort of deep divisions, and that I see as inevitable on the one hand, but also as, so to speak, the creative potential that drives our conversations about what specific forms democracies should take. And some forms of democratic theory emphasize instead that that this conversation needs to be contained by a distinction between reasonable and unreasonable, that everything that we then bracket as passionate is problematic, but I'm skeptical whether that form of sort of obsession with reason and reasonableness and rational politics is sort of helpful, because our everyday experiences, when we think about questions of justice and injustice, is that our own response to these questions is driven by sentiments, even passions. And if that is the case, politics is as much about, democratic politics is as much about our passions and sentiments as it is about our sort of reason and rationality and rational deliberation. I'm not against it, but it's just one facet. And what drives all of these things, equality, freedom, justice, injustice, is in the end grounded in democratic sentiments, and not in democratic reasoning.
So let me come to another aspect, which is a structural aspect. So you don't deal with it in the book, but this has become, I think, one of the fundamental questions, which is a question of belonging, which is where passions are very strong. And the question is, who belongs to the demos? It's very much about excluding people who are already living in a society but are not said to belong to the demos. So it's not even just about excluding those who want to come in as refugees, but it's also about actively excluding those and denying political rights to many people on grounds that they're not sufficiently integrated. What constitutes then sufficient integration is a very tricky question. So should children born in Austria be given the right to citizenship by birth, then they would belong to politically to the demos. But if you exclude that and say no, they have to earn somehow your right to belong. So I think these are very fundamental questions which structure the composition of the demos. And I don't know, I mean, in a way they are then almost prior to the cultivation of form of life. Could one exclude them from consideration?
I would argue that these questions are entangled. And so I think that questions of debates over migration and debates over integration, first of all, suffer from a sort of binary opposition that I don't find particularly useful. Open borders on the one hand, and sort of very restrictive border regimes on the other. And the one thing, whatever European governments decide in terms of immigration policies for the next 20 or 30 years, it is disturbing to think that many European cities have a population of about 20, 25, sometimes 30% of inhabitants who are not citizens.
40% almost in Vienna.
So let's take the 40% in Vienna. These are inhabitants of a city, and they're subjected to a government and live under the authority of a government. And even if we take a very simple definition, namely John Locke's definition, that a republican government is a government by consent, and that means the consent of everyone subjected to the authority of the government, we can only say we have a huge problem of legitimacy. And a huge democratic deficit. And this is not about sort of naive, I don't know, welcoming strangers, and but it's a simple sort of political travesty that we do not address as forcefully as we should. And that creates huge problems for democracy, both as a system of government and as a way of life. Because why would anyone be tempted to cultivate a democratic ethos if she or he is constantly told, you're very happy to experience democracy in everyday life, but we will not allow you to vote. We will not allow you to fully participate in public life. And this sort of the development of a sort of hierarchy of rights among European, the population of Europe, the inhabitants of Europe, is a deeply problematic issue. And on top of that, even those who acquire citizenship rights are often less active in politics than those whose ancestors have lived in Europe for, let's say, I don't know, 150 years or so. And that is another level in which the question of migration, or then obviously it's more about migration background, citizenship, political participation, is one of the key dilemmas that European democracies are facing.
Let me pick up two questions here. I have one from, well, actually one is from Aisha Challa. I come to that in a moment. The other is from our fellow Carolina Koizura. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Can we think about democracy as something that is performed? So this is about the performative dimension, by which I think about free spaces of deliberation and argument during which people come together as equal. And if yes, how then does your concept of democracy as a way of life speak to the division between public and private space, especially in the authoritarian context where private spaces often act like a public one? Or does this division even make sense?
So, very generally speaking, I would immediately agree that questions of theatricality are central to the ways in which we live our lives and in which we experience equality and freedom. So the kind of the theater of everyday life is something that is inherent in the humdrum of everyday banality. I'm not quite sure how this relates to the divide between the private and the public, because in both spheres, theatricality is central. We act out certain roles. We perform authority or lack of authority, and so the only thing that I think is central to the idea of liberal democracy is that there is such a thing as a right to privacy. That however we conceive of democracy as a way of life, and whatever the ways are in which this concept bridges the divide between the public and the private. There is something, a sphere that is independent of the state, it is independent of society, it is independent of our communal loyalties, etc.
Mm-hmm. So Aisha's question goes back to some of your earlier remarks where you were also taking certain ideas from Simmel. And she says, what you have been describing sounds very much like Simmel's concept of sociability, which often depends on the cultivation of domains of commonality which are not based on cohesion. On the contrary, they entail dissonance, ambiguity, and friction, but symmetry. Right, free and equal, as you say. I'm very much for this, she says, but where do we locate or envision the structural conditions of the reproduction or the making and remaking of such spaces or frictional domains of commonality?
So the short answer is the spaces and the places that allow for these experiences, that allow us to live with dissonance, ambiguity, and friction. And the shorthand for that, in my case, is democratic commons. And this includes, but I would, the whole range of institutions that are open to us as citizens. So schools, parks, swimming pools, etc. But I will take one example to illustrate, again, the specificity of what I have in mind. Take public libraries, municipal libraries, which I think are central institutions of a key pillar of a democratic commons. And something that we have witnessed over the past 40, 50 years is that municipal libraries have closed down small branches in neighborhoods in which particularly poor and vulnerable people live, and have restricted access to the municipal, therefore restricted access to the municipal library. And so this is what is important here then is that, as I said toward the end, that a democratic commons and a democratic way of life doesn't come for free. It is a commons, it costs something, and it is for a democratic polity to sustain these institutions that allow for these experiences.
So this is an interesting question. So let me pursue sort of two aspects of this particular strand of thought, and which is, so I do take your point about swimming pools or public parks, so they're not privatized spaces. One doesn't have to pay for certain kinds of access, like libraries, etc. Right? But even if there are public libraries, the fact that these spaces exist, do they necessarily, by just their sheer presence, guarantee access? Does it not need much more to guarantee access than there's the fact? I mean, at the moment, I take your point that under austerity politics of the kind, a lot of these spaces are, a lot of these places are being dismantled, or even through the privatization of a lot of public spaces, they're no longer accessible. But think back 30 years, we had public libraries everywhere. I mean, when I was living in Berlin 30 years ago, there were public libraries in every neighborhood. But the children you saw there came from a very particular background. So the fact of the existence of these spaces doesn't really guarantee access. So the question again would be to think about what are the enabling conditions here which need to be provided for, because, or put it differently, you can have a public space. Like, for example, there are parks in Berlin in which on Sundays you will see a lot of immigrant families gathering. I mean, this is all pre-pandemic, gathering, cooking together, eating, right? So they are sharing a public space, but this doesn't necessarily foster exchange across community lines. So you can share spaces back to back rather than just the fact of the existence of a space. Does it necessarily turn this into a space for the kind of interactions you're thinking of, or what is needed on top of that?
So I think the first thing is that my vision of coming together in the democratic commons is a coming together marked by conflict and friction.
But back to back can be without conflict and friction. Right? This is if you see what I mean, right? So it's not just either agreement or conflict. You can share the same space, but we have little to do with one another. We're not in conflict with one another. We just don't use it as a space of interaction, either because there are linguistic barriers, there are cultural, So I think something must happen to promote the kind of ethos that you are asking for. This is what I'm asking.
Yeah, but I mean, it's so let me begin with let me take the example of the parks, right? So conflicts over who can barbecue, how much, and what. Who can play music, how loud, and what.
Very important.
Yeah? These things give rise to conflict. Take a swimming pool. It's a hot summer day. People are sort of streaming into the municipal swimming pool. And in every encounter, they negotiate the questions of sort of sexual propriety, respectability, how much intimacy, how much distance, all of this is about. And here again, Simmel is really interesting, or I think even more interesting than Simmel, if I may say so, Siegfried Krakauer. And so these everyday encounters are constantly about differences. Mm-hmm. And so there's a simultaneity of intimacy and distance, and all of this is marked by conflict and friction. And I think I agree with you that a simple fact that something is there is not enough. But a simple fact that something is there can make a huge difference. I'll give you one example.
Absolutely right.
And one of the most striking things that has happened in Europe over the past 50 years is the disappearance of the public toilet. Not fully disappearance, but sort of 4 out of 5 public toilets in most European countries have disappeared. So instead, we now have privatized.
Paying.
And you have to pay. Maybe not much, 50 cents a euro. But a toilet where somebody has to pay €1 no longer is a public toilet. What is the drug addict going to do? What is the homeless person going to do? What is the, 12-year-old high school student going to do who wants to hang out with his or her friends on a marketplace or something? So these are things where I understand that a public toilet in and of itself is not going to save democracy, so to speak. but without public toilets, public life in cities ceases to be what it must be in order to help a democratic spirit ethos thrive. Right? And that's what I have in mind in terms of the kind of the material basis and what for which I then use the concept of democratic commons.
Yeah. So to take this argument to a totally different level from public toilets, I'm going to say, what about the internet? Is the internet with an unmoderated public sphere? So is it a democratic commons, and is it the place where a lot of democratic sensibilities are being cultivated? So I think maybe from what I'm trying to get at is the idea of some kind of regulation, some moderation. Does it in your narrative? It's sort of somehow just sui generis comes about through simple interaction, and I am skeptical of whether it comes about purely through the existence or purely through. If it's not there, of course, something very fundamental is lacking. But just by the fact of like the internet, for example, right? So unmoderated, without norms of which would regulate our interaction with one another, or some modicum of shared norms. So this is where I want you to think about the relationship between forms and norms.
So I'll begin with an analogy. When we speak about parks, when we speak about swimming pools, obviously they're regulated. It's not that there are no rules when you enter a swimming pool. There are no rules when you enter a park. Right? So the short answer is yes, the internet needs regulation in the same way that a park or a swimming pool needs regulation. It's not my field of expertise, so I don't know what that regulation might exactly look like, and I'm not even on Twitter. So, but I agree with you that there needs to be some form of regulation. It's not very surprising, even when we talk about free speech. Free speech doesn't exist in a sort of fancy vacuum, but is contextual and always bounded by certain rules and regulations. However, what I sometimes think when I read scholarship about the internet and democracy, digital democracy, etc., is that much of the discussion loses sight of the fact that yes, we may be spending more time in front of the computer and sort of following social media, but at the same time we continue to be human beings with a body, material, we lead a material life, and we encounter fellow citizens in countless settings and occasions. Now the pandemic here has not been helpful.
No, definitely
and
not.
one of the problems is that the language of social distancing, in fact, was completely misleading, because what the epidemic called for was physical distancing. And we should have spent a lot more time thinking about how we can preserve the intersecting social circles that make democracy possible despite physical
distancing.
But that's for the next pandemic, perhaps. But so the key in terms of social media is, yes, I think we need some form of regulation, but that's not very surprising, because a lot of other things are also bounded and regulated, including the market. And the other thing is that again, our concern about digital media and digital democracy should be supplemented by a conversation how best to strengthen sort of analogous forms of democratic experience.
So somebody here is asking exactly what's going to be my next question to you, which was who should do the moderation or regulation. This is where I think the devil lies in this detail. So we have Nicola asking, most of the regulation on the internet is done by private business. How do you see this interaction of public spaces? This is what I was going to sort of get to, like social media apps that are controlled by companies which react to pressure from capitalist customers, but also bow to authoritarian states like China. So it's a question now of what kind of moderation, who is the regulator, what kinds of spaces are then spaces for the cultivation of democratic dialogue, even disagreement. And strife.
So again, it's not my field of expertise, but take the question of the environment and questions of pollution as an analogy. There's no question that governments have the right and an obligation to regulate companies, pharmaceutical companies and other companies that have contributed and continue to contribute to the pollution of natural resources. And so if one can take some forms of the incivility that social media give rise to, as an example of environmental pollution, so to speak, then we have a strong case for regulation. And I think that the larger context here is that in the 60s, early 70s, it was clear that a sort of the market logic was something you would find in a market economy. And today we have shifted from a market economy to a market society where everything is regarded as a question of money and efficiency, of benchmarking, etc. And this is true for schools, it's true for universities, it's true for swimming pools, museums, etc., etc. And I'm not arguing for squandering taxpayers' money, but I'm arguing for a different vision of a democratic commons in which market forces have their place but are carefully regulated and contained so they don't, in a sense, invade spaces in which market logic is ultimately self-destructive.
No, I take your point. I think there is a larger argument definitely to be made for the nurturing of those spaces which are conducive to a cultivation of all kinds of interaction and sensibility without their being privatized spaces, because otherwise you are restricting access in a very particular way. So I think we're going to stop there. We are exactly on time, unless I'm going to give you the opportunity to have a final word if there's something which nobody touched on, but there's something which you do want to come back to in all the discussion.
I just want to thank everyone for the wonderful, stimulating questions. And it's obviously a conversation that will continue, and I think should continue. And it's a conversation in which, if I may say one thing, in which the questions we ask may prove much more important than the answers we provide. And the questions we ask tend to be questions that can be answered either way. But however we answer them, I think it's important that we start asking these questions forcefully, both in scholarly and in public context.
No, I take your point entirely. So thank you very, very much for opening up the conversation, I think, with very interesting questions which go away from our normal framework of discussions around democracy, where we are looking at institutions, we're looking very much within a particular normative framework. I think what you do by pointing to the limitations of that framework and the need to think about forms, ethos, way of life, etc., is to open up questions which I think need to be brought into the whole framework of discussions on democratic theory. So yes, this certainly opens up many vistas, democratic vistas, for, to come back to Whitman, for longer conversations, and thank you very, very much for this really interesting one.
Thank you.